Venezuelan oil doesn't behave like the light oil that many people imagine when they think of energy. In parts of the Orinoco Belt, it is closer to a dark, heavy, and extremely viscous mass, trapped beneath one of the largest energy reserves on the planet. But the size of the reserve doesn't solve the technical problem. Having oil doesn't mean being able to use it. Turning these reserves into fuel, exports, and global influence. It would require rebuilding a huge network of wells, pumping stations, marine terminals, pipelines, refineries, and industrial infrastructure spread over thousands of kilometers. And that's exactly where a new geopolitical discussion begins. Amid the global competition for energy and for refineries configured for heavy crude, the United States is once again turning its attention to Venezuela as a possible strategic piece of its energy system. But to what extent is this really feasible? Stay with us for the next few minutes and understand what is concrete and what still seems distant in the debate about the large-scale reactivation of Venezuelan oil. To understand the scope of this issue, we first need to locate where this oil is. Most of the Venezuelan reserves are concentrated in the Orinoco Oil Belt, a regional area located north of the Orinoco River, in the central eastern region of Venezuela. We are talking about one of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, estimated at around 303 billion barrels, according to the United States Energy Information Administration, known by the acronym EIA. But the size of the reserve tells only a small part of this story. A large part of this oil is classified as heavy oil, or extra heavy. This type of oil is much more difficult to extract, transport, and process than the light oil produced in other regions of the world. This completely changes the required infrastructure. In addition to the production fields, oil upgrading units, dilution systems, specialized pipelines, marine terminals, complex refineries, and an extensive logistics network come into play, connecting Venezuela to the U.S. Gulf Coast refining hub. This difference between reserves and produced volume helps to explain a central question. If Venezuela's reserves are so large, why has the country seen its production plummet over the past few years? For decades, Venezuela was one of the biggest oil powers on the planet. In the early 2000s, the country was producing more than 3 million barrels of oil per day, and it maintained an extremely important energy relationship with the North American market. A large part of this oil went directly to refineries on the Gulf Coast of the United States, which were especially prepared to process dense, acidic, and highly complex oil. Exactly the profile found in Venezuela, but the scenario changed dramatically. Production plummeted. According to the EIA, the country went from about 3.2 million barrels per day in 2000 to less, to 800,000 barrels per day in 2023. With that, a paradoxical situation arose. Even with some of the largest reserves in the world, Venezuela started operating far below its historical capacity. In recent years, however, the topic has returned to the center of international discussions for an important reason. The United States has refineries that are highly adapted to processing heavy oil. At the same time, a portion of the light oil produced from shale formations in the United States does not perfectly replace that industrial profile. In other words, there is significant technical compatibility between Venezuelan oil and certain American processing facilities. In addition, specific licenses granted to companies like Chevron, along with discussions about partial relief of restrictions in the energy sector, have put Venezuelan oil infrastructure back on the international radar. But turning this compatibility into reality requires much more than political agreements. It requires practically rebuilding the entire energy system. And that's exactly where the issue stops being just about geopolitics and becomes a major challenge of engineering, infrastructure, and industrial logistics. First of all, it's important to separate reality from exaggeration. Today, there is no fully operational megaplan for Washington to take over or control Venezuelan oil on a large scale. What does exist are real moves toward partial easing of sanctions, limited resumption of operations by companies like Chevron, and discussions about a possible gradual increase in Venezuelan production. The main obstacle, however, is not just in politics, it's in the infrastructure. This happens because the oil from the South American country depends on an extremely complex physical network. The Orinoco Belt contains heavy and extra heavy oil, which is much more viscous than the conventional oil produced in regions like the Middle East. In practice, this oil does not flow easily. In many cases, it needs to undergo extensive industrial processing even before it can be transported by pipelines. That's where the upgrading units come in. They're known in the industry as upgrades. These structures work like large industrial plants designed to partially transform high viscosity oil into a lighter, more transportable product. It's a process that involves heating, separation, mixing, and sophisticated industrial treatments. Without this, a significant fraction of Venezuelan oil simply can't flow efficiently through conventional infrastructure. This creates another logistical challenge. Venezuela doesn't just depend on producing oil. At many times, it also depends on access to diluents, chemical components, and complementary industrial systems to make this production operationally viable. Then comes the transportation infrastructure. Old pipelines, degraded pumping systems, corrosion, leaks, and poor maintenance have become recurring problems in recent years. Recovering this system requires much more than just occasional repairs. In many cases, it would be necessary to rebuild entire sections of the energy industrial base, including pumping and pressurization stations, industrial sensors, control centers, storage tanks, operational safety systems, and continuous maintenance structures. But the challenges don't end on land. A large part of Venezuelan exports depends on maritime terminals in the Caribbean, including storage structures, industrial piers, and loading equipment for large oil tankers. This point opens another essential chapter: maritime logistics. VLCC ships, which stands for Very Large Crude Carrier or Large Crude Oil Transport tankers, require robust port infrastructure, proper dredging, and highly specialized operations. In some cases, draft and operational structure limitations affect transit and maritime transport operations, increasing complexity and cost. At the same time, another bottleneck appears far from Venezuela: the refineries. Many of these American industrial units on the Gulf Coast were adapted over decades to process heavy oil coming from Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada. This includes sophisticated coking, cracking, and desulfurization units. Many of these refineries were built to handle oils that are harder to transport and process industrially. This is one of the reasons why the Orinoco crude remains relevant for certain industrial sectors in the United States. But there's a factor that's often overlooked. All this energy infrastructure depends on stable electricity, constant maintenance, and operational safety. In recent years, Venezuela has faced severe blackouts, industrial shutdowns, and loss of energy capacity. In other words, recovering production doesn't just mean restarting wells. It means rebuilding an integrated heavy engineering system. There are interesting comparisons in other parts of the world. Oil recovery projects in countries like Iraq and Libya also required years of rebuilding energy infrastructure after periods of severe instability. Even in scenarios with strong international investment, expanding large-scale production usually takes years, not months. In the end, Venezuelan oil remains an asset of enormous strategic importance. But turning underground reserves into real energy influence would require one of the largest industrial reconstruction operations in the modern oil sector. When it comes to oil from the South American country, the numbers help us understand why this topic draws so much global attention. Venezuela's proven reserves amount to around 303.8 billion barrels. It's the largest in the world, a little over 6 billion more than Saudi Arabia's reserves. To put this scale into perspective, That's roughly equivalent to 17% of the world's proven oil reserves. But production tells a different story. In the early 2000s, the country produced more than 3 million barrels per day. In 2023, that number dropped to less than 800,000 barrels per day, about 5.3 times less than Brazil, which has proven reserves 11 times smaller than Venezuela. It's as if one of the largest energy structures on the planet started operating with only a fraction of its own capacity. Recovering this system would require large-scale investments. Estimates related to the reconstruction of the Venezuelan oil sector often reach tens of billions of dollars. At the exchange rate of the US dollar at the time this video was made, $30 billion would be equivalent to about 151.4 billion Ws. With that amount, it would be possible to buy almost 4,000 units of the most expensive car registered in Brazil, the Ferrari LaFerrari. It would also be enough to build more than 150 kilometers of subway lines, considering urban megaprojects at a cost of about 1 billion Rs per kilometer. Another key comparison is at the industrial scale. Many refineries on the Gulf Coast of the United States have been specially adapted for heavy crude infrastructure that is quite different from conventional facilities designed for light crude. Therefore, it's not just about extracting oil. It's about running a broad industrial chain spanning engineering, logistics, maritime operations, and energy processing on a global scale. If part of this Venezuelan energy infrastructure returns to operating at a higher scale in the coming years, the impacts could be significant both for Venezuela and for the international energy system. For Washington, this could mean greater access to high-viscosity oil, compatible with the complex refineries on the Gulf Coast, reducing some of the dependence on other international sources with the same oil profile. For Venezuela, a possible production recovery could increase exports, generate foreign currency inflows, and stimulate investments in industrial and energy infrastructure. But there's a central point. None of this points to a quick transformation. Reports from Reuters and the EIA, as well as analyses from the energy sector, indicate that any consistent recovery would depend on years of investments, regulatory stability, operational recovery, and physical reconstruction of infrastructure. In this way, Venezuelan oil still has enormous strategic potential. But turning potential into real production requires rebuilding a sophisticated energy chain, and that is far from being a simple process. In fact, the big question may not be just who controls the oil in the Orinoco Belt. The harder question is, who would have the capital, technology, and institutional stability to rebuild the infrastructure needed to make it flow again on a global scale? Underground reserves alone don't move ships, refineries, or economies. Modern energy power depends on something much bigger: wells, pipelines, terminals, refineries, ports, electric power distribution, and heavy engineering, all working at the same time. And maybe that's exactly where the real new empire of the 21st century. Thank you for watching this video up to this point. What do you think about Venezuela's oil reserves? Would the United States have the capacity and influence to really make all of this work in the best possible way? Leave your opinion in the comments. That's all from me. Big hug and see you in the next video.